How do we arrive at something specific through form? Getting tired is one way. Deleuze would rather us be exhausted. Tiredness not really thoroughly marking the foreclosure of possibility as such, but just the limit of realization. I stayed in bed the day after my birthday, not especially tired. I don't want to take us to the limit. The rocks were cold. Ornette Coleman releases his album Dancing in Your Head in 1977 on Horizon Records. 2 years later, Horizon releases the debut album of Yellow Magic Orchestra, which of course is instrumental in the development of techno in Detroit over the next decade. Several minutes into their 1980 performance on the American musical variety show Soul Train, the members of YMO stop miming instrumental action while pre-recorded track plays on. The audience stops dancing, or stops dancing with their bodies anyway. Despite the suspension of its production in 2006, Soul Train is still the longest-running first-run, nationally syndicated program in American television history, as the show's opening sequence claims. Next year, Entertainment Tonight will surpass Soul Train's run. Asked about the deployment of disco moves in her work, Hito Sterel responds that no, these moves aren't entirely subsumable to capitalism's logic. There is a remainder. In the last scene of Tom McCarthy's 2001 novel, The Remainder, an airplane floats in circles at the behest of its hijacker until it runs out of fuel, presumably. The novel ends before the plane's free fall. Freud says one never abandons a libidinal position, even when a substitute is at hand. The project then isn't just to build new objects of attachment, but new objects that require one to assume new positions, not at the expense of a present position. We can get around this problem of never willingly abandoning a libidinal position by figuring out how to be in two positions at once, or no position at once. Not a problem of having multiple objects, but multiple positions, since this scrambles the logic of multiplicity. This sounds good, because the most useful manual of techniques here isn't psychoanalysis, but magic. If I'm moving my body over a surface, it gets stuck. We get stuck to our attachments. Attachment isn't rigidity. I'm not proposing a neologism, but consider liquidarity. In its early 19th century British usage, the term headspace describes the empty northern hemisphere of a page. 3 years after his final concert performance and 10 years before Ornette's album is released, pianist Glenn Gould produces his first radio documentary, The Idea of the North, which collages 5 voices discoursing on northern Canada. Gould calls this layering contrapuntal. Gould is interested in that northern margin as a platform for a fantasy. Fantasy is sticky. Counterpoint, or the system that regulates the independence of multiple voices sounding simultaneously in a musical harmony, is codified during the Renaissance in Western Europe. 4 years before Ornette Coleman's album is released, Rosalind Krauss condemns conceptual artists for their traditionalism, by which she means the structural reliance of their work on a viewer's mental space. She'd rather figure out the work with her body. Counterpoint also requires us to get into this headspace. The blankness of a page, headspace, has always been noisy, though. My friend tells me the physical locus of Chicago's noise scene is a spot called Club Rectum. Leo Bersani publishes the answer to his question, is the rectum a grave? 10 years after Ornette Coleman releases his album Dancing in Your Head in 1977 on Horizon Records. We've all played enough noise shows to know that noise music has a lot to do with corporality, but I have long been particular about the sort of groove on which I float a headspace of dancing. To cruise is to cross. The Motion Picture Association of America introduces a 4-tiered rating system in 1968. The rating of X is adopted from the British Board of Film Classification, which creates the category in 1951 amid anxieties about corruptibility of a newish marketing demographic of youths. Pornographers begin to self-label their films with the non-trademarked X rating shortly after its introduction to the United States. Self-imposed XX and XXX ratings soon followed, extensions anticipated already in the early 19th century with XXX and XXX denoting the relative alcoholic strength of beers. Designations borrowed from the X's of poison labels, likely formal simplifications of the skull and the crossbones symbol, standardized during the upheaval of ongoing revolt, famine, and epidemics in the late Middle Ages, which begins to regularly appear as the standard of cruising pirate vessels by the 18th century. Kenneth Anger films in Stars and Fireworks 30 years before Ornette Coleman releases his album Dancing in Your Head on the Horizon record label. 10 minutes in, the camera pans down in a shot of a domestic interior, sequentially revealing hearth with fire and 2 supine, shirtless sailors. One breathing hard, the second's head crossed out in a radiating halo scratched directly into the film. The ocean's an easy side for homo desire with its stacked crews of men, CREWS and CRUISE. But it's the crossing rather than cohort that floats this. 62 years later, fellow Southern Californian Katy Perry sings, "As you shoot across the sky, I." The UI in cruise is after the Dutch cruisen to cross. Its etymological trajectory before the 17th century is thus identical with cross. That's to say nothing of X as an epistolary figuration of kisses, nor of X as an indicator of the unknown. Descartes formalizes the algebraic unknown, but not the treasure map. A mid-20th century speed reading instruction book represents the default text and exercises with parallel columns of XXX. Another exercise instructs us to run our hands over the surface of the page. A 2008 bareback porn video released by Treasure Island Media, Planting Seed, records the collection in a Tupperware of the cum of various men, which is then funneled into the anus of the orgy's bottom. Leo Bersani and Adam Phillips describe the transgenerational and transhuman bonds engendered by transmission as a community, albeit one ultimately non-viable, fluid bonds, liquidarity. Cross comes from the Latin crus. However, before the Latinization in the early Middle Ages, the native English word is rud, which is preserved in today's rod. Rud is the cross on which Jesus suffered, as well as the staff which Jesus is represented as carrying in early Christian art. Wood, in either case, which is to say that which tends towards the sun by some hidden fire of its own. 40 years before Ornette Coleman's album Dancing in Your Head is released, Antonin Artaud is given a rod that he believes to be the same rod carried by Jesus and latter by St. Patrick. Artaud figures this staff as the instrument with which the gate of the infinite is opened for humanity. After a sea crossing from France to Ireland, Artaud's cane is confiscated and thereafter vanished after he brandishes it in a Jesuit cathedral. Artaud's abstinence is well known. Needless to say, Old English rude also means cock. Freud fails to locate the oceanic feeling in himself because he wants to dive. A cruise ship, too, is erotic. Among other reasons, a water strider remains on the surface of its water by distributing its weight. The oceanic feeling isn't floated by empirical rigor, but by cruisy compulsion. Each point of contact of the water skimmer's appendages is an attachment. An attachment is sticky and casual. To cross isn't to betray, only to betray singular attachment. Successive generations of water striders are born with and then without wings in alternating compromises of mobility and weight. This guarantees new genres. A new lake is a new scene. To cross is to mark a locus, but more, to describe transition. A space on the dance floor gets opened up. A passage over a form is also a form. The oceanic feeling doesn't wash over its feeler so much as its feeler washes over it. Freud, too, like us as well, has this place in the generational polymorphism of winged appendages. If a virus crosses and binds us to erotic exchanges long spent, that's a kind of omnipresence or a kind of being in multiple positions simultaneously. Artaud anticipates and figures himself as the key agent in the world's imminent consumption by fire. 2 years after Ornette Coleman's album Dancing in Your Head is released, 50,000 people gather at a baseball stadium in Chicago for a radio promotion that promises the immolation of a mass of disco records. The fire, like Artaud's, is revolutionary in a literal sense, in that it will reanimate the body of rock and roll. Preservation, of course, requires purification, the elimination of bodily contaminants, inner and outer. Pure noise is white. The fire at Comiskey Park Field is for black noise. The records are gathered in a box in center field, slightly smaller than Tony Smith's cube die, fabricated 11 years earlier. For Artaud, the cosmological conflagration initiated by his cane will involve not mundane fire, but the fire of pure substance, a fifth element. Of course, a record cannot be burned. We all burned our share of CDs in the 2000s. In the ensuing riot of bodies and bonfires on the field, Jimmy Pearsall announces from the press box, "I would rather swim than stand out there on the baseball field." 8 years after Ornette Coleman's album Dancing in Your Head is released, Doug Ishar takes photos of Chicago's lakeside cruising scene. Lake Michigan's color and horizon figures in nearly all of these pictures. Lake Michigan's color and horizon figures in nearly all of these pictures. The lake is blue. After he makes prints for the first time 24 years after taking the shots, Ishar explains that his MO at the lakefront was to be omnipresent. The rocks were cold. The ability to be in all places at once is typically only attributed to God or magicians. A magician uses a wand or a rod. Norman Curring, who makes data-based images of oceanic colors for scientific ends, lists the physical factors that affect Lake Michigan's color. Sudden blooms of microscopic marine plants. Wave action that stirs up bottom sediments and grinds air bubbles into the water, and precipitates of dissolved calcium carbonate that come out of the solution when water temperatures rise. Spunk and funk both have their roots in a word meaning spark, that which starts a fire, which of course is not something ultimately material. Spunk swerves towards something like metal or strength of character before acquiring its slangy connotation, but of course semen, as in seminal, is already spark. Funk's descriptee slides from fire to smoke, an atmospheric disturbance, a bad smell, a noise. A rogue etymology of funk has its black 20th century usage pulled from the Kikongo term lufuki, meaning the strong bodily odor of venerated elders. Funk is noise in any case, the interference transmitted along with any signal, a kind of noise that is in the body, or a body as a kind of noise. Dancing in your head means sweating it in rather than sweating it out. In the headspace, which is marked by X's and which is blank but not without erotic gravity, there is funk. Hans Haacke begins making sculptural work in the early 1960s that allegorizes this private club. His condensation cube needs ambient interference, the cube's sweat beaded by the presence of bodies but limited to the form's interior walls. We might have to be tired to do any dancing here at all. The operation runs as software, not as hardware. If we go soft, we can start to really get a whiff of this form as form. I mean, as a loved object. I mean, as a body with a real and ongoing specificity. You make me so soft.